Will she marry me and leave that loser husband behind? Douglas Thompson's voice echoed through the ballroom as he knelt on stage, holding a diamond ring that cost more than most people earn in 5 years. 300 guests from Boston's tech elite turned to look directly at her, sitting at the head table next to her. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks as Rebecca, my wife of 6 years, covered her face with her hands in an Oscar-worthy performance. "I do," she shouted, running toward the stage in his $15,000 Versace dress, leaving he alone at the table like a complete idiot in front of the entire business community he had helped build. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before exploding into deafening applause. The sound echoed off the marble walls of the Grand Meridian Hotel, like cannon shots celebrating my public humiliation. My name is Joe Martinez, and at 34 years old, I just watched my wife accept a marriage proposal from his boss at the annual company party that I financed with every penny of her grandfather's inheritance. But as Douglas Thompson kissed Rebecca on stage, believing he had just acquired both the woman and the company of his dreams, he had no idea that he was celebrating with money that was never his to begin with. The laughter around me sounded like hyenas fighting over a carcass. Executives I had met at family dinners were now whispering among themselves, some recording his reaction with his phone to share on social media later. "Poor Joe," I heard someone comment behind me. I always knew Rebecca was out of his league. The irony was almost comical. For 6 years, I had allowed Rebecca, to take all the credit for Nexus Dynamics, the artificial intelligence company we valued at $450 million. She gave the interviews, appeared on the covers of business magazines, accepted innovation awards at international conferences. Meanwhile, I remained in the shadows, introduced as the supportive husband who helped with administrative matters. The truth was that he owned 67% of the company and had personally developed every algorithm that generated our $180 million in annual revenue. Rebecca took the stage with the grace of a crowned queen, waving to the crowd that gave her a standing ovation. Douglas wrapped his possessive arms around her, her expression displaying the satisfaction of a predator who had finally captured his prey. "Rebecca has always deserved someone who could offer her the world," Douglas announced into the microphone, his voice laden with arrogance. "Someone who truly understands the value of what she has built." What he has built. The words cut like a sharp blade, but I kept my expression neutral. 6 years of meticulous documentation in our home safe told a completely different story about who really built the technology empire that Douglas thought he was acquiring along with my wife. I calmly rose from the table, adjusted my tie, and began walking toward the exit. Each step echoed on the polished marble as 300 people watched the humiliated man flee her own public destruction. But they didn't understand that my silent departure was not that of someone who was defeated. It was that of someone who had finally decided to stop pretending that performance and reality were the same thing. If you're enjoying this story of corporate betrayal and revenge, be sure to subscribe to the channel to find out how a moment of public humiliation turned into the biggest strategic mistake Douglas Thompson ever made. Because while he was celebrating his victory on stage, I was already mentally accessing the financial security protocols I had implemented years earlier, when trust still meant partnership rather than systematic exploitation. The limousine driver was waiting for me in the hotel parking lot, completely unaware that his next ride would be the last one I would pay for with a Nexus Dynamics corporate card. I slid into the leather seat as the sounds of the party still echoed through the open windows of the Grand Meridian. "Home, Mr. Martinez?" asked Carlos, the same driver who had taken us to the party just 2 hours earlier. "Yes, Carlos. And thank you for all her dedication over the years." Her expression in the rearview mirror showed confusion at the premature farewell, but he simply nodded and set the car in motion. Through the rear windows, I watched Douglas Thompson on the hotel stage, still holding Rebecca like a trophy she had won. Douglas was everything I despised in the business world. At 42, he had built his reputation as an investor by buying small companies and firing half the employees to optimize profitability. His fortune came from family inheritances, not innovation or hard work. He had met Rebecca 8 months ago, when he began pursuing Nexus Dynamics as a potential acquisition. His first meetings with me were tense. I immediately detected his predatory intentions and rejected any proposal for a partnership. "His wife is very protective of your business," Douglas commented to Rebecca during a business dinner, his voice laden with condescension. "Perhaps he doesn't understand the opportunities that a strategic partnership could offer." From that moment on, Douglas changed tactics. Instead of trying to convince me directly, he began courting Rebecca, feeding his ego with compliments about her business acumen and natural leadership. He invited her to business lunches when I was traveling, sent flowers to the office with cards praising her brilliant presentation at conferences. Rebecca absorbed every word like a dry sponge. During 6 years of marriage, I had deliberately remained in the background, allowing her to shine as the public face of our company. I thought I was being a supportive husband, creating space for her to develop confidence and leadership skills. But Douglas exploited this dynamic with surgical precision. He whispered venom in her ear during every interaction, suggesting that I was holding her back and that she deserved recognition on her own merits. "Rebecca, you are clearly the brains behind the operation," he would say during dinners where I was absent due to development commitments. "It's a shame that the business world still underestimates visionary women like you." What Douglas didn't know, and Rebecca had chosen to forget, was that every Nexus Dynamics algorithm had been born from my mind during sleepless nights of programming. I had personally developed the artificial intelligence systems that processed medical data with greater accuracy than any competitor on the market. His grandfather, Roberto Martinez, had been a self-taught programmer who worked for NASA during the Apollo program. He taught me that true technology doesn't come from fancy presentations or networking, but from quiet hours solving problems that others consider impossible. When he died 3 years ago, he left her a $12 million inheritance with one condition: use the money to build something that matters. I invested every penny in Nexus Dynamics, supplementing it with personal loans to reach the $25 million needed for our initial capital. Rebecca did not contribute financially to the company. Her role was to be the charismatic spokesperson while he focused on technical development. During our early years, this division worked perfectly. She had a natural talent for presentations, and he preferred the brainwork of creating revolutionary technology. But something changed when Douglas came into our lives. Rebecca began to believe her own stories about being the visionary mind behind Nexus Dynamics. In interviews with business magazines, she described technical concepts with the confidence of someone who had actually developed them. "The architecture of our neural network represents a quantum leap in medical data processing," she explained to journalists, using terms he had spent weeks teaching her. "My background in business allowed me to identify gaps in the market that traditional engineers can't see." It was technically true that Rebecca had an MBA, but she had never written a line of code in her life. Her contributions to our products were purely cosmetic: deciding interface colors, approving marketing materials, choosing office suppliers. Over the past 6 months, Douglas had intensified his seduction campaign. He sent her articles from business magazines highlighting innovative women in technology with post-it notes attached. "This reminds me of someone I know." He invited Rebecca to exclusive conferences where she could share her expertise with other industry leaders. The turning point came 3 weeks ago when I overheard a phone conversation between them. Rebecca was in our home office, speaking softly while thinking I was asleep. "You're right, Douglas. Joe has always treated me like a glorified assistant," she whispered. "He makes all the important decisions himself and then asks me to present them as if they were his ideas." The irony was suffocating. I literally created the ideas and then allowed her, to present them as her own. But in the distorted version of reality that Douglas had planted in her mind, my generosity had turned into manipulation. "He underestimates you because he's afraid you'll discover you don't need him," Douglas replied, her seductive voice even over the phone. "Men like Joe use talented women as shields, protecting his own insecure egos." That night, while Rebecca slept beside me, I accessed our financial systems for the first time in months to review exactly who owned what. The incorporation documents I had personally drafted confirmed what I already knew: 67% of Nexus Dynamics was registered in my name, 33% in her. The distribution reflected our actual contributions to the company: my initial investment, my technical development, my intellectual property protected by patents registered exclusively in my name. Rebecca had signed those documents 6 years ago, when she still respected the difference between creating and presenting. But Douglas had corrupted her perception of reality. Now she genuinely believed that she deserved total control of a company that existed only because he had built it with his inheritance and his brain. The limousine stopped in front of our residential building in Back Bay. Through the windows of the 30th floor, our penthouse glowed with automatic lights that he had personally programmed using protocols from our own technology. "Have a good evening, Mr. Martinez," Carlos said, unaware that he was saying goodbye forever. As the elevator rose silently through the 30 floors, I mentally calculated how many security protocols I would need to activate to protect my intellectual property. Douglas thought he was acquiring a company, but he would soon discover that he had only acquired a presenter with no access to the codes that generated our revenue. Because although Rebecca could smile for the cameras and accept romantic proposals on stage, she had never learned the difference between performing innovation and actually creating it. And that ignorance was about to cost her much more than she could have imagined. The elevator rose silently to our penthouse as I processed the magnitude of the betrayal I had just witnessed. 30 floors of silence to digest the fact that 6 years of his marriage had been reduced to corporate theater planned at his expense. Our doors opened to the apartment I had bought with money from my grandfather's inheritance. Every piece of Italian furniture, every carefully selected work of art, the home automation system he had programmed himself, all financed by the algorithms he had developed while Rebecca accepted applause for innovations she couldn't even explain technically. The lights turned on automatically as I entered, revealing the living room where Rebecca and I had celebrated our first $1 million deals. Where she practiced presentations for investors using slides I created during late nights of concentrated work. My phone rang. It was Rebecca. "Joe, where are you? Everyone is asking for you. Douglas wants to take us to dinner at Ocean to celebrate she hesitated, our new chapter." "Our new chapter," I repeated, savoring the irony. Interesting choice of words. Don't be dramatic. You know this was always inevitable. Douglas can offer opportunities you could never provide. He understands his vision in a way you never. I hung up before she could finish her sentence. 6 years of partnership reduced to a phone conversation where she justified adultery as professional advancement. I headed to our home office, where a built-in safe held the most important documents of our business life. My fingers typed in the combination, my grandfather's date of death, a detail Rebecca never bothered to memorize. Inside the safe, meticulously organized stacks of documents told the true story of Nexus Dynamics. Incorporation agreements I had personally drafted. Patent records with my name as the sole inventor. Bank statements showing every transfer from Roberto Martinez's estate to our business account. The company's articles of incorporation were on the first page. 67% registered in my name, 33% in his. A distribution that accurately reflected our actual contribution to the business. My money, my technology, my intellectual property. Rebecca had signed those papers 6 years ago, when she still respected the difference between creating and presenting. When she still believed that partnership meant complementarity, not systematic exploitation. I grabbed my laptop and accessed the internal systems of Nexus Dynamics. As the chief architect of our technological infrastructure, I had implemented security protocols that guaranteed my administrative access to all financial and technical operations. What I discovered in the system logs made me stop breathing for a moment. Douglas Thompson had been accessing our confidential data for 3 months. Rebecca had provided he with access credentials that allowed him to review our contracts, analyze our intellectual property, and examine our financial structure in detail, violating at least 12 confidentiality agreements. They weren't just planning a romance. They were orchestrating a hostile takeover disguised as a love story. The files showed that Douglas had identified every one of our operational vulnerabilities. Contracts with clauses that could be reinterpreted if leadership changed. Investors who could be persuaded to support new management if properly pressured. Key employees whose loyalties could be bought with more attractive salary offers. Rebecca wasn't just betraying our marriage. She was selling my company to the man who had seduced her with promises of recognition she had never earned on her own merit. My phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Martinez? This is Patricia Owens from the law firm Owens & Associates. I received an interesting call from Douglas Thompson an hour ago. He would like to discuss options for corporate ownership restructuring, specifically related to Nexus Dynamics." Patricia was one of Boston's most respected corporate lawyers, specializing in hostile takeovers and intellectual property disputes. Douglas was bringing out the heavy artillery before I had even finished dinner with his wife. "Mr. Thompson mentioned that you would be interested in exploring voluntary stock transfers to simplify the ownership structure following some recent personal changes," Patricia continued. "Personal changes," I muttered, recognizing the legal euphemism for divorce followed by corporate takeover. "I'm not interested in any restructuring," I replied. "And I would like to retain your services to protect my interests against any attempt at outside interference in my company." There was a pause. I understand perfectly, Mr. Martinez. I can be at your office tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss defensive strategies. As I organized the documents from the safe into strategic piles, my personal assistant, Kevin, called with urgency in his voice. Joe, something strange is going on. 3 of our top developers received job offers tonight. Offers with salaries 50% higher than what we pay, from companies I've never heard of. Kevin, he had worked with me since the early days of Nexus Dynamics. He understood our technology almost as well as I did and had detected suspicious patterns that other employees might have overlooked. Do these companies exist? I asked. On paper, yes. In reality, no. They were all incorporated last week. Same registered address. Same corporate lawyer. Douglas was trying to dismantle my technical team before formalizing any acquisition. Without the developers who truly understood our algorithms, Nexus Dynamics would be nothing more than an empty brand with impressive contracts but no capacity for continued innovation. Kevin, I need you to do something for me. Early tomorrow, we will implement emergency security protocols. No employee will have access to source code or technical documentation until further notice. Joe, that will paralyze our development. Temporarily. But it will protect our intellectual property from people who confuse access with ownership. I hung up and returned to the documents scattered across the table. Each piece of paper represented years of dedicated work and emotional investment in a future that Rebecca and Douglas imagined they could redistribute among themselves as if it were common property. But he had made a fundamental miscalculation. For 6 years, I had allowed Rebecca to shine as the public face of our company because I believed that partnership meant mutual elevation. I thought he was being a supportive husband, creating space for her to develop confidence and leadership skills. In reality, he was being naive about the difference between creating opportunities and allowing exploitation. Douglas had exploited this dynamic with surgical precision. He whispered poison in Rebecca's ear during every interaction, suggesting that I was limiting her and that she deserved independent recognition. What neither of them understood was that recognition without substance is just performance. And performance without technical foundation is vulnerable to anyone who actually understands the underlying mathematics. I picked up the phone and called his accountant, Arthur Webb. Arthur, I need a complete audit of all Nexus Dynamics assets. Intellectual property, contracts, investments, everything. And I need her done by Friday. Joe, that's too fast for a complete audit. This isn't a preventive audit, Arthur. It's preparation for war. When I hung up, I realized my decision was made. Rebecca and Douglas had turned our marriage into a corporate battlefield. They had chosen performance over partnership, exploitation over collaboration. Now they would discover that the man who built the systems they coveted also held the key to dismantling them. But first, they needed to understand exactly who had been humiliated at that party, and who really controlled the $180 million they thought they had just won. Because while Rebecca could accept romantic proposals on stage and Douglas could dream of easy acquisitions, neither of them had learned the fundamental difference between accessing a system and actually owning it. And that ignorance was about to become the most expensive education either of them would ever receive. Dawn found me in my home office, surrounded by documents scattered like pieces of a complex puzzle. Each piece of paper represented a potential weapon in the arsenal I was building against Douglas and Rebecca. Patricia Owens arrived punctually at 9 in the morning, carrying a leather briefcase that contained decades of experience in corporate warfare. His gray hair and gold-rimmed glasses conveyed the authority of someone who had destroyed business empires with surgical precision. Mr. Martinez, I reviewed the documents you sent last night, she said, settling into the armchair across from my desk. His legal position is absolutely solid. 67% registered in his name, protected intellectual property, documented initial investment. Douglas Thompson is trying to steal something that was never his to begin with. She opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers organized by category. But we need to act quickly. He has already mobilized lawyers specializing in hostile takeovers and is using tactics I recognize from previous cases. What kind of tactics? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Internal destabilization. Offers to key employees, selective leaking of information about management problems, pressure on investors to question current leadership. It's standard corporate warfare playbook. Patricia was right. His phone had rung 3 times during the night with calls from investors concerned about rumors of instability at Nexus Dynamics. Each conversation followed the same script: vague questions about his leadership ability, suggestions about the benefits of external management, and praise for Rebecca's strategic vision. Strategic vision. He's building a case to justify outside interference, I continued, making it seem like the company needs to be saved from an incompetent manager. Exactly. But we have advantages he hasn't calculated. Patricia pulled another set of documents from the folder. First, you never signed prenuptial agreements. That means that technically, Rebecca is entitled to half of the marital assets, but not the intellectual property registered exclusively in his name. And second, Douglas made a fundamental mistake. By accessing confidential data without proper authorization, he violated at least 8 federal intellectual property protection laws. We have a record of every login, every file accessed, every document downloaded. She was right. My paranoia about cybersecurity had created monitoring systems that documented every interaction with our servers. 3 months of illegal activity recorded in logs that would serve as devastating evidence in any court. How long do we need to implement countermeasures? I asked. 48 hours to completely protect her intellectual property. 1 week to document all the crimes he committed. 2 months to permanently destroy any chance of acquisition. While Patricia organized our legal strategy, Kevin worked to implement security protocols that would turn our company into a digital fortress. Every line of code, every proprietary algorithm, every critical database would be protected by layers of encryption that would take decades to break. Joe, I've implemented the blocks you requested, Kevin reported via video conference. No employee has access to the core source codes. All critical systems require her personal authorization for any modification. What about the employees who received offers from Douglas? 3 of them came to talk to me directly. They were uncomfortable with the aggressive approach and wanted to know what was going on. It seems Douglas underestimated the loyalty of the team. It was typical of Douglas. Her arrogance prevented her from understanding that true technical talent values work environment and purpose more than just money. The developers I had personally recruited understood that they were building revolutionary technology, not just generating profits for investors. On Thursday afternoon, Rebecca called for the first time since the party. Joe, we need to talk about our situation. Her voice carried a new authority, as if our separation had transformed her into a more confident executive. Douglas has some interesting proposals for an amicable transition. Transition to what? He is willing to buy your share of the company at a fair price. You could start a new project, perhaps something smaller, more suited to his management style. The condescension was palpable. 6 years of marriage had been reduced to a business negotiation where she offered crumbs for the empire he had built with his own inheritance and expertise. What would that fair value be? I asked, more out of curiosity than real interest. 80 million. It's a generous offer considering you never had the right profile for public leadership. Douglas can turn Nexus Dynamics into a truly global company. 80 million for the 180 million her stake was currently worth. Less than half the real value, offered as if it were a personal favor. I'll consider it, I lied, hanging up before she could continue her rehearsed presentation. In fact, I was considering something completely different. Arthur had completed the financial audit, revealing spending patterns that would turn Douglas from predator to prey when exposed publicly. Joe, you need to see this, Arthur said, arriving at the office with a grave expression. Douglas Thompson has a history of fraudulent acquisitions. 5 companies in the last 10 years, all following the same pattern. He spread documents across the desk. He seduces the wives or partners of founders, creates marital instability, offers solutions that involve transferring ownership, then fires the original founders and sells the companies to larger conglomerates. The evidence was irrefutable. Rebecca wasn't the first woman Douglas had manipulated to acquire valuable technology. He was a serial predator who used romance as a corporate acquisition strategy. How much has he made from these operations? I asked. Approximately 400 million in 10 years. Our company would be his biggest trophy. That night, while Rebecca was probably having dinner with Douglas planning my professional destruction, I was finalizing preparations for the most expensive education either of them would ever receive. The monitoring system I had installed on our servers had detected a new attempt at unauthorized access. Douglas was becoming more aggressive, trying to download intellectual property files during non-business hours when he thought no one was watching. Each illegal attempt was automatically documented and sent to Patricia, building a criminal case that would transform him from corporate predator to federal defendant. If you're following this journey of corporate revenge, subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple financial audit became the most powerful weapon against those who believed they had won before the battle even began. Because while Douglas celebrated her romantic conquest and Rebecca practiced speeches about new leadership, I was preparing a lesson on the difference between accessing a system and actually owning it. A lesson that would begin the next morning, when they would discover that the man they considered defeated had spent the entire week building the most sophisticated trap of her lives. Friday arrived with the precision of a Swiss watch. At 8 in the morning, while Douglas was probably still sleeping next to my ex-wife, I was at the Nexus Dynamics office implementing the first phase of an operation I had meticulously planned throughout the week. Kevin found me in the server room, where I was personally reconfiguring our security architecture. Each line of code I typed created additional layers of protection around the intellectual property Douglas thought he was about to acquire. "Joe, I got a strange call from reception," Kevin said, her voice heavy with concern. "Douglas Thompson arrived 20 minutes ago demanding access to our facilities. He said Rebecca had authorized an urgent technical audit." I smiled without looking up from the keyboard. "Have him wait in the lobby. He'll learn about patience." As I finished implementing the last protocols, my phone rang. It was Rebecca, her voice laden with an authority she had never legitimately possessed. "Joe, Douglas needs access to our servers immediately. There are due diligence issues that can't wait. You're disrupting important business." "What business?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "I don't recall authorizing any external audit." "She doesn't need your authorization. As a majority partner." "Minority partner," I corrected gently. 33%, if my memory serves me correctly. And 67% still beats 33%, last time I checked basic math. The silence that followed lasted exactly 15 seconds. Enough time for reality to begin to penetrate the fantasy that Douglas had constructed in her mind. "Joe, don't be ridiculous. You know we always make joint decisions about the company." "Joint decisions," I repeated, savoring the irony. Like the decision to give his confidential data to Douglas without his knowledge? Or the decision to accept a marriage proposal on stage during his anniversary party? I hung up and went back to work. At 9:15, Patricia Owens arrived at the office carrying a briefcase containing 3 months of investigation into Douglas's illegal activities. "Joe, we have enough evidence to bury him for decades," she announced, spreading documents across her desk. "Intellectual property infringement, unauthorized access to protected systems, attempted market manipulation. The FBI would be interested in this." But the FBI would only be the beginning. Patricia had discovered something even more devastating during her investigation. Douglas Thompson doesn't have the real liquidity to acquire companies the size of Nexus Dynamics, she explained. All of his previous acquisitions were financed through loan schemes secured by the assets of the companies he was buying. It's essentially financial fraud on a massive scale. The pieces fit together perfectly. Douglas seduced the wives of founders, created marital instability, offered solutions that involved transferring ownership, then used the newly acquired assets as collateral for loans that financed his next acquisitions. It was a Ponzi scheme disguised as empire building. "Rebecca has no idea she's being used as bait in a criminal operation," Patricia continued. "When federal auditors discover the pattern, she could face charges as an accomplice." At 10:30, I received an emergency call from our account manager at First National Bank. "Mr. Martinez, we had some unusual attempts to access Nexus Dynamics accounts this morning. Someone tried to authorize significant transfers using credentials we don't recognize." Douglas was becoming desperate. Her attempt to access our systems had failed, so now she was trying to bypass our security by directly attacking our bank accounts. "Block all transactions that don't have my personal signature and biometric authentication," I instructed. "And document every unauthorized access attempt for our lawyers." At 11 o'clock, Kevin returned with news that confirmed my suspicion about the scope of Douglas's operation. "Joe, 3 of our top clients received calls this morning from someone posing as a business continuity consultant. The calls questioned our operational stability and suggested transferring contracts to alternative suppliers. Douglas was attempting to destabilize our customer base to force a crisis that would justify outside intervention. It was a tactic Patricia had identified in his previous acquisitions. But he had fundamentally underestimated one crucial thing: I knew our customers personally. I had developed relationships based on mutual trust and consistent results over 6 years of genuine innovation. I spent the next hour personally calling each customer who had been contacted, explaining that we were facing attempts at corporate interference and that all legitimate communications would come exclusively through official channels. "Dr. Martinez," said Jennifer Walsh, Chief Technology Officer of our largest hospital account, "we were confused by these calls. His systems are working perfectly. His algorithms have literally saved hundreds of lives this year. Why would anyone question her stability?" It was a perceptive question. Her technology spoke for itself. Douglas could manipulate perceptions and create romantic drama, but he couldn't alter medical data that consistently showed his systems outperformed any competitor on the market. At 12:15, the confrontation I had been expecting finally happened. Douglas and Rebecca barged into my office without knocking, her expressions displaying the arrogance of people who believed they had the right to reorganize my life without consultation. "Joe, this childish resistance has to stop," Douglas announced, his voice laden with the condescension he had probably used with previous founders he had manipulated. "Rebecca and I have plans that will benefit everyone involved." "Benefit whom?" I asked, not looking up from the documents scattered across my desk. "The company he built together deserves leadership that can expand globally," Rebecca said, using the script Douglas had obviously rehearsed with her. "You've always been better with technology than with strategic vision." The irony was suffocating. The strategic vision had been entirely his from the beginning. He had identified gaps in the medical market, developed proprietary technological solutions, and built customer relationships that generated $450 million in valuation. Rebecca had been a talented spokesperson, but confusing presentation with creation was the kind of mistake only people without technical expertise make. "Douglas, do you have experience in artificial intelligence applied to medical diagnostics?" I asked directly. "I have experience in identifying opportunities for growth and operational optimization," he replied evasively. "That's a no," I translated. "Rebecca, can you explain how our pattern recognition algorithms process radiological imaging?" Her hesitation confirmed what I already knew. 6 years of presentations had created fluency in terminology, but not real understanding of the systems that she described to investors. "Joe, these technical questions are irrelevant," Douglas interrupted. "The important thing is to maximize value for stakeholders through professional management." It was at that moment that I decided to reveal my first card. "Douglas, you've spent $80,000 trying to bribe my employees over the past 2 weeks, I announced calmly, pulling a detailed report of every offer he had made from the drawer. "Every call, every proposal, every recruitment attempt has been documented and reported to the appropriate authorities." Her expression instantly changed from arrogance to something close to panic. Those are just exploratory conversations about career opportunities. With shell companies you created specifically to destabilize my operation," I continued, producing incorporation documents that showed her ownership of the fictitious companies. "That's a federal crime, Douglas." Rebecca looked between us with growing confusion. For the first time since Douglas had entered our lives, she was seeing evidence that the man who had seduced her was not the visionary entrepreneur he pretended to be. "And Rebecca," I turned to her with an open folder displaying his actual rights in the company, "you own 33% of a company that I financed entirely with his grandfather's inheritance and developed using expertise he never possessed." The incorporation documents were there, with our signatures from 6 years ago. The patents were there, all registered exclusively in my name. The bank statements were there, showing $25 million transferred from Roberto Martinez's estate to our business account. Douglas attempted one last desperate maneuver. "Joe, you're being emotional. Marital separation doesn't have to affect business operations. We can reach an agreement that allows you to steal intellectual property he never developed using money he never invested." I finished the sentence. "Douglas, he doesn't have the financial resources to acquire Nexus Dynamics. Patricia discovered that all his previous acquisitions were financed through fraudulent schemes." I produced the investigation report detailing exactly how Douglas operated. Every company he had acquired followed the same pattern: seduction of wives, creation of instability, offers of solutions involving property transfers, use of newly acquired assets as collateral to finance future operations. "You are a serial criminal who uses romance as a business acquisition strategy," I declared. And Rebecca was just his next victim in a pattern that the FBI is very interested in investigating. The ensuing silence was broken by the ringing of the phone. It was Patricia, calling to confirm that the criminal documents had been formally submitted to federal authorities. "Mr. Martinez," her voice loud enough for Douglas and Rebecca to hear every word, "the U.S. Attorney's Office has decided to open a formal investigation into intellectual property violations and corporate fraud. Search warrants will be executed Monday." Douglas Thompson, the corporate predator who had destroyed 5 companies in 10 years, finally understood that he had chosen the wrong victim. As he tried to process the magnitude of his defeat, I was mentally calculating how many years of federal prison his activities could yield. Douglas left my office as a defeated man, his hands shaking as he tried to process the magnitude of her downfall. Rebecca followed him in silence, finally realizing that she had been manipulated by a serial criminal who used romance as a corporate acquisition strategy. The following Monday, search warrants were executed simultaneously at 3 addresses: Douglas's office, his apartment in Beacon Hill, and the shell company he had created to recruit my employees. Federal agents found evidence of corporate fraud spanning an entire decade. 5 companies destroyed, dozens of lives ruined, hundreds of millions stolen through schemes that turned romance into organized crime. Mrs. Martinez, Special Agent Rodriguez called on Wednesday. "We would like to thank you for your cooperation." Without her meticulous documentation, Douglas Thompson could have continued operating indefinitely. The investigation revealed that Rebecca was not a knowing accomplice, just another victim of the psychological manipulation that Douglas had perfected over years of practice. That didn't lessen the betrayal, but it explained how an intelligent woman had been reduced to a tool of a corporate predator. 3 months later, Douglas was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for corporate fraud, intellectual property infringement, and racketeering. The sentence included restitution of $400 million to the victims of his previous schemes. Rebecca attempted reconciliation through phone calls he never answered and emails she deleted without reading. The divorce was finalized with her retaining only the assets she had legitimately contributed: our summer home in Cape Cod, purchased before we met Douglas. Nexus Dynamics flourished under my sole leadership. Without romantic distractions or external pressures, I was able to focus completely on developing technologies that saved real lives in hospitals around the world. Kevin Chun accepted a promotion to Chief Technology Officer, leading a team that grew from 15 to 80 developers in just 6 months. Our medical diagnostic algorithms were implemented in 300 hospitals, reducing identification errors by 40%. "Joe, we've received an acquisition proposal from Google," Kevin announced during our quarterly meeting. $2.3 billion for the entire company. I rejected the offer without hesitation. Money had never been his primary motivation. My satisfaction came from building technology that mattered, from solving problems that others considered impossible, from honoring my grandfather's legacy through genuine innovation. A year after the party where it all began, I organized a completely different celebration. Not to impress investors or feed egos, but to recognize the employees who truly created value through their dedicated work. This year we saved approximately 12,000 lives through more accurate diagnoses, I announced to our team gathered in the office. Every line of code you wrote, every algorithm you optimized, every bug you fixed contributed directly to families returning home together. The difference between this celebration and the previous one was the difference between substance and performance. Between building something meaningful and just building wealth. Between genuine partnership and systematic exploitation. Rebecca found work at a smaller consulting firm, where her presentation skills were valued without requiring technical expertise she never possessed. She occasionally appeared in business articles discussing lessons learned about due diligence in business partnerships. As for me, I discovered that the best revenge was not to destroy Douglas, but to build something so solid that attempts at destruction only revealed his own weakness. Genuine satisfaction came from creating authentic value, not from elaborate systems of punishment. Today, when I look out the window of my office in Cambridge, I see a company that truly reflects my values: innovation over ego, substance over style, collaboration over exploitation. The $180 million that Douglas imagined he could steal now funds research that will revolutionize preventive medicine. History teaches us that predators always underestimate their prey when they confuse kindness with weakness. Douglas saw her generosity as vulnerability, her preference for background as incompetence. That misperception cost her everything. If this story of corporate betrayal and mathematical justice has inspired his, subscribe to the channel for more stories of how authentic achievement always trumps borrowed glory when truth confronts performance art. Because in the end, the difference between predator and prey is not who is more aggressive, but who actually built the system in which both are operating. And when you build the system, you always hold the keys to redefining it.